Well, good evening, ladies and gentlemen. I'm Bruce McDonald, and this is the Talamanca Review. So let me get my volume bumped up here. That should be good. It's Sunday, the 14th of September, 11:08 p.m., and things could not be more precarious right now. I think precarious is the word I would use to describe everything that's going on right now. I would like to be able to tell you that it's going to get better, but it's not. You know, this idea of the split that I talked about last night, it just intuitively came to me actually when I was doing the show with Robert Phoenix. Then after the show, it just came back and hit me. There was a boomerang effect to it, and I went, there's a lot more there. And I don't know if everybody gets this, I don't want to make myself sound different or special in any way. In fact, of course, I'm not. Everybody's the same. But I do think that a regular internal life, a focused internal life, and I'm going to stop using the word meditation, although it's a great word. But let's just call it a focused internal life in which you try to awaken various parts of yourself and integrate them into your daily life, as opposed to separating everything into various factions, and that's very popular in certain circles, there's all this talk about out-of-body experiences now, astral travel. It's a fascinating topic. I myself would not advocate that you deliberately try to learn to astral travel. I would say just begin some form of focused inner work in which you still yourself and calm yourself and ask to unfold at the pace that's best for you, because your oversoul, your higher self, the God within you will guide you. But when we as humans have particular desires and we try to enact them in the realm of consciousness, it almost always ends up poorly. And I've been in this game a long time, met a lot of people, a lot of different kinds of people, a lot of masters of various paths, Taoism, certain schools of Buddhism, Sufism, meditation schools, 33rd generation Kung Fu masters from China. And I've spoken about this before on my show. They all have certain signature vibrations. And some of these people I've been able to know for quite some time. And I find the people who go into the deliberate unfoldment with a kind of I want this, I want that attitude from the ego, eventually they'll run into some trouble. And if they correct quickly, it won't be egregious. And correcting quickly would be moving to submission. And, a lot of people don't like to hear this, but, Islam, the word actually means submission, submit to God. And again, my definition of God makes that a lot more palatable, I think, although the definition of God in Islam is quite evolved. So I always do these things in conjunction with my higher self, what I would call my inner master, because we all have a guru inside of us. It's us. It's a latent part of us. It's a buried part of us. And you can begin communicating with it simply by praying. And but after the prayer, you want to get into a kind of unified approach to these things, and a consistent daily practice like going to the gym. Now, these days, I do a lot of laying down. I do 90-minute sessions where I lay down and I'll cross my feet, and I'll usually fold my hands like a mummified pharaoh like this. And I'll have my head at about 45 degree angle at the edge of the sofa. My wife comes in sometimes and says I'm snoring, but I'm completely lucid. I hear the fridge open, and when she calls me, I go, yeah. It's what you're training yourself to do is stay awake in the deeper states of your consciousness. Anyways, an almost nonsensical rabbit hole there. What I'm getting at is these things just pop into my consciousness. I don't know where they come from. But this idea of the split is way bigger than, I mean, I'd have to sit down and start making notes. And, when I have to start preparing like a college professor to do a podcast, I don't know if podcasting is going to be that much fun. I prefer to do them just off the top of my head and let what's going to happen happen. Sometimes I have some clips like yesterday, the Oppenheimer stuff and everything. But I'll be damned if I'm not starting to see a narrative in all of this, and a very human-propelled narrative. And it's making me more and more agitated, furious, upset, disconcerted, disharmonious with the people of the book, the prophecy people. I don't know why this is such a hard concept for people, or such a hard fact for people to see. 9 times out of 10, prophecy is the machination of human organizations. And again, we've been all over this in the Talamanca Review, and in many instances, the block for most people is the simple concept of intergenerational planning. Nobody's that disciplined, Bruce. Empires fail in 300 years. How could something crawl along through time? Well, it's generally multidimensional. And once let's say the fraternal relationship with the group of entities or beings that the group is working with, they will continue to work with ancestry. Okay? And that's why you get a lot of bloodline talk in all of the controlling discourses that we're getting. And it's right in the Bible that, the sins of the father will be visited on the son. And we've got the emerging science of epigenetics, which is the transference of consciousness through genetics generationally. An example of that would be the granddaughter of a Holocaust survivor having memories of being in an internment camp, in a concentration camp in World War II, even though they were born in the 1970s. The memory transfers from the grandmother. This has all been documented. Epigenetics is another unfoldment of the science of consciousness from an academic or institutional perspective that is beginning to align with what the sages have been teaching us and telling us since the beginning of time. So the idea of an intergenerational plan is actually much easier to understand when you understand that the people doing it have understood the concept of epigenetics and consciousness transfer through genetics or bloodline. They may not have used the language we use today, and a lot of times just a shift in language will throw people. They'll get confused, right? This is why I make such a point of looking words up when I'm doing the Talamanca Review and making sure that the definition is correct. And if it's not correct, then I immediately tell you this is what the original definition of the word was. And if the dictionary gives you some kind of etymology, then you'll get to the root of the word, and you'll see that the modern usage is no longer coherent with the root. And so language has an evolutionary pattern as well. And our language is becoming much more despiritualized, much more Marxist, much more flat, much more one-dimensional, much more linear, and it's being robbed of beauty. And, this is not something I talk about a lot on the Talamanca Review. And it was very interesting to get into the literary stuff with Robert Phoenix, because I don't bump into too many people who have a genuine appreciation for literature and will take time to read it even in their 50s and 60s. Go back over the poems you loved in your 20s. And, this has become a fascination of mine since I got the iPad. It's just unbelievable. By the way, I'm finishing my reread of the Border Trilogy by Cormac McCarthy, which is All the Pretty Horses, The Crossing, and Cities of the Plain. I read it in my early 30s, in, I guess, the mid-90s. I would have been 30 in 96, born in 66, yeah. So I would have been 30 in 96. I read it from about 96 to, whenever they came out, I got them and I read them. I fell in love with McCarthy the moment I read Blood Meridian. And boy, did I ever miss a lot. And that's the thing about literature. is that you can go back to it and get more from it from a second and a third reading. There's a richness and a depth to it, a kind of spiritual transfer if it's done really well, or a transmission if it's done very, very well. Nobody cares about that anymore. I mean, nobody's reading real literature anymore. It's been weaned out of our society. And I understand why. People would rather be on their tablets, their phones, their computers. Nobody wants to sit around and read for 2 hours anymore. I mean, some people do. There's some very successful YouTube sites online that focus on literature, and they're very inspiring. Anyways, this idea of the split, and this idea, there's something intentional about the nuclear bomb. I'm trying to lay words to it. That, and if I'm right, that means there was a hidden intent behind the entirety of World War II. Now, I realize I'm getting on pretty thin ice here in terms of sanity. And if you don't want to skate out this far onto the lake with me, I understand. But it'll be a good yarn. And if you listen, you'll enjoy yourself. You don't have to believe what I'm saying. It really just plants a contemplative seed. And if it's going to sprout in your consciousness, it's going to sprout in your consciousness. But that's going to come from your unconscious giving the sunlight and the water to it, okay? Meaning that you're ready to know it and the truth will grow inside you. And this is how things work. This is how everything works. This is why propaganda is so successful. This is why when something is repeated 3 times, most people will believe it. Right? There's a reason people pay $500,000 or $1 million for 30 seconds of airtime during the Super Bowl. You think advertising doesn't work? You think it's money laundering? It isn't. They understand the human psychology. And in that regard, I find a little bit of vulgarity to that because, psychology at the end of the day is a medical art or a medical practice. And as such, it should fall under the Hippocratic Oath. But the way psychology is used today, it would be like unnecessarily removing somebody's appendix or organ harvesting during a routine hip replacement. You wake up from a hip replacement and, some part of your body is gone. And that's completely unethical, and people are shocked when they hear things like that. It does go on, right? You got Falun Gong being organ harvested in the Chinese prison system. Getting back to the idea of narrative structure, getting back to the idea of reality being, in a sense, a kind of spoken word presentation to us, You can start to read reality, which is a spiritual perception that comes, and it comes from spiritual practice. And it's, as much as I enjoy, I enjoy leaving my body too. I do it all the time in meditation. I've been to places. I've been to crystal cities. I've been taken to other planets. I've been taken places I have no words for. Okay? A lot of things happen in deep meditation when you learn to sit for 2 hours. Okay? But really, as I get older, I don't know what gets the dogs all worked up on the mountain at night. Everybody's got dogs, and sometimes they'll all go off, like all 30, 40 dogs at the same time, including mine. Life in the country. And it's fascinating, right? Out-of-body experiences, Monroe, the Monroe Institute, and all of these sorts of things. But you got to understand that is just elementary. That is an elementary thing in the journey of consciousness. It's not that big a deal. And spending a lot of time focusing on the astral plane is not really going to go well for you. There's nothing to, it's not the right way to approach your inner life. Okay? Your inner life should be approached in the traditional religious way or spiritual way, in which you're in a state of submission, asking, and this is the only point in which I move away from the religious people. I don't think you should ever, ever, ever worship a named entity. Okay? Maybe I could do a whole podcast on that in the future, but whatever created this reality, the true creator has no name. Okay? It can never, it can, something going on there on my computer. It can never really be encapsulated in this way, okay? So you want to always approach things in the mystery of it, and you don't want to get bogged down in any kind of dogma or scripture. And I guess I'm going to go into a little bit of a political rant right now. It is absolutely disgusting to me the way that Charlie Kirk's death is going to be equitized. Okay? Brave human being, great debater, great articulator. One of the things about the Abrahamic religions, and Jews are especially good at this, is public debate. Because those debates can take place in the flat line of rationality minus the deference to faith in God. Okay, so, when you listen to Charlie Kirk, he's talking about family, he's talking about morality. You can't really argue with him. But at the end of the day, he's also talking about adherence to a religion that should be on its deathbed now. Okay? These religions are evil now. I mean, I suppose it's possible individuals can have a personal relationship with Christ. I think the Christ is still massively engaged with human beings. I think the expression of it that we see through the filtration of the public and social consciousness is disgusting. I think morality should be self-evident for human beings. Anybody with consciousness has morality because they understand the causal force, which is my way of saying karma, meaning that every pebble you drop in the pond, whether it's a thought, a feeling, or an action, is going to send ripples out. Those ripples are going to draw attention to the point where the pebble was dropped, which was you, and that attention is going to come to you in some form of reciprocal energetic transaction, a ripple upon you. You send a ripple out, a ripple comes back to you. The ironic mirror. And so I think that these religions should gracefully pass away. And I know that's a tall order to ask. I know that's a big thing to ask, but it is something that I think is absolutely necessary. Now, why am I speaking about these things like the split and the atomic fission and fusion, which is the splitting of the atom, cracking open the atom, which is the foundation of our reality, right? Now, this is not to be confused with the splitting of a cell, which is mitosis, which replicates or propagates human life and mammal life and all life on the planet that's beyond a single cell organism. Okay? So mitosis is the replication process in cells. And the reason we die is the cells don't lose the ability to do that at a certain age. It's in our genetic coding. Our death is coded into our genetics. I'm convinced it could be coded out, but I'm also convinced that I wouldn't want to live forever. So another reason I'm thinking about all these things, and, so Robert Phoenix was one of the people that many of my listeners were telling me that they listened to. And I had not listened to Robert that much. I knew of him. I knew he was around. And another one is this gentleman, I think his name is Jason over at Archaics, who's got this 138-year cycle theory. I don't necessarily think that's true. I mean, but what I'm saying is when you begin to entertain these ideas, you're imaginatively or contemplatively drawn into a new context. Okay? Now, when I look at let's take literature as an example. And it's not a bad idea to have an acquaintance with something in a hobby form, like something that you do in your life that gives you another contextual reference point, okay? So one of my contextual reference points for time is literature, okay? So if the world gets completely reset every 138 years, do they have all this stuff lying around to just be deployed into the world? Like, where does Shakespeare come from? Where does Walt Whitman come from? Where does Robinson Crusoe come from? Where does Cervantes come from? Right? Where does Mary Shelley come from? Where does John Donne come from? You know, you can look at poetry and you can see this very deliberate continuity of growth in consciousness based on time, with certain universal principles repeating themselves in new ways. You know? And all of it, for the most part, uniformly beautiful until the modernist and specifically the postmodernist movement, in which things became, let's say, less than beautiful. Andy Warhol is an example of this. You know, we call Andy Warhol an artist. We also call Rembrandt an artist. We also call Michelangelo an artist. Would you put Andy Warhol on equal footing with Rembrandt and Michelangelo? I would not. Not at all. So Warhol mutated art. What a dog action out there. So Warhol, in a sense, mutated art. Okay? Now, when you look at literature, let's start with Shakespeare, who's about 500 years ago, okay? And let's say the King James Bible, you know, finished, I think, in about 1511. Brought about by King James. Okay, so how do they do the reset every 138 years? It doesn't make any sense. Okay? And it's right up there with flat Earth, right? In terms of not making sense. Because if it's a flat Earth, it means that pretty much all of our science is false as well. Because our entire understanding of reality is a heliocentric. Let me just look that word up because I don't want to lead you astray. Heliocentric definition. Having or representing the sun as the center, as is the accepted astronomical model of the solar system. Let me just look at the etymology here. Oh, they don't give any etymology. That's interesting. So the word comes into existence in 1800, but what I'm talking about is a center point with things bound by an energetic structure and spinning around something. So the atomic structure is very similar to the solar system. And this gives us the idea of the fractal construction of God. And this gives us also the yogic conception of each and every human being is the entire universe encapsulated in an individual life. We just have to peel away the layers of the onion. And in a sense, I guess Da Vinci was also representing this when he said man is the measure of all things. And so, while I don't agree with the 138-year cycle, I do see things that are curious to me that I don't have answers for. And I do see, I'll get to my, what I was going at with the split and the atom in a minute, but I just got to finish going down this rabbit hole. I don't see the 138-year cycle as being valid because there's too many things in our timeline that are carried forward. Now, are they all edited? So if we could do these energetic systems that the Tartarian people were talking about, the next question would be, where's the Tartarian literature? Where's the Tartarian painting? Where is the Tartarian music? Because a civilization that advanced and different from ours, working on a free energy system, a Tesla-based grasping energy from the ether energy system, that would produce an entirely different consciousness, social consciousness. The universal consciousness is consistent no matter what phase of civilization we're going through. Atlantis, Lemuria, the Greeks, the Hebrews, the Romans, the modern American Empire. The universal construct is the same. But the social consciousness is merged with the universal consciousness to produce a kind of fingerprint in terms of its identification of time and context to the art. But all of our art is within this Judeo-Christian model. You go to any museum and you look at pre-modern art or art before the Reformation, it's all Christian religious art. That's all it is Christian religious art. You look at music, okay? So where did Beethoven come from? Right? Where did Mozart come from? Do they just have these things on a shelf somewhere, and when they destroy a society and reboot it, they just introduce it to the children, the Cabbage Patch children, and say, oh, this is Mozart, he wrote this music 400 years ago, and they tell their children who tell their children who tell their children, and everybody gets the illusion of 400 years of history? A bit strange, don't you think? But the thing that makes me contemplate the cycle that Archaics is talking about is the leap forward. Now, I capture this really well in a chapter called Crossroads in Stardust Ranch. Very well. And it talks about the beginning of the 20th century. And the 20th century begins everything that's normal for us now. And before the 20th century, we didn't live in the world even remotely close to the world we're living in now. We lived in a world where monthly bills didn't exist, where you owned your land, it was deeded to you, and the farm was divvied up between sons and grandchildren, and people would keep farming for generations, right? And, people lived by candlelight or firelight, and they made a lot of their clothes, or they went to town and bought their clothes. Now, the clothes might have been shipped over from a manufacturer in Europe, in early America. You go to town, you buy your work trousers, you buy your overalls, you buy your jacket for the winter, these sorts of things, right? And there were no monthly bills. And then by about 1905, everything kicks off. We get electricity. We electrify. We buy into. Boy, I can't believe this is slipping my mind. The rival to Tesla, whose energy system we ended up going with. I can't believe his name is slipping my mind. And he was backed by J.P. Morgan, and we went with the... No, it'll come to me in a bit, but We went with the AC/DC power system because that allowed for a monthly bill. And that electrical bill set the foundation for the entire modern economy we live in. All the monthly bills. And then you get the beginning of propaganda with dislocated voice in the form of radio and then telephone. I guess you could say it begins with the wire service. You know, being able to send messages across the country in America through a wire service. And then you get the radio and you get the telephone, and people start communicating beyond their immediate communities. Now, this is the story we're told. And from there, everything just goes crazy. Everything just like, suddenly there's this explosion of creativity. And we go from shitting in outhouses to space exploration in the span of 3 or 4 generations. And we are being told that for basically 2,000 years, going back to Christ, nothing really changed in those 2,000 years. There are a few advancements in weaponry. Gunpowder was invented. The crossbow was invented, changing European warfare. The longbow was invented. But technologically, it was basically manure fertilize, using manure as fertilizer, and the same farming techniques. And everybody rode horses or pulled things in a wagon. And this went on for centuries. And sitting dormant within us was all of this creative potential to bring about what's come about in the 20th century. Now, this is where I lean towards archaics. And I go, this guy is on to something, because there is a cycle here. And is that cycle really a destruction cycle? Are we completely wiped out and a remnant of the human race is preserved, children, and those children are raised in a false history and they go forward, and this is repeated? So if it's 138 years, let's say 33 years for a generation, okay? Let's say 30, 60, 90. So children, parents, grandparents. And then people are procreating at 30 years old. So let's say 30 years for a generation. So 4 times 30 would be 120. Plus another 18 years. So 4.5 generations. Now, if you stop and you think about this, just think about this for a moment. What are we? If we can do all of this in 4 generations, the computer, iPhones, everything that we're doing, what are we? What is our true limit? What is our true potential? And I'll tell you this, if the 138-year cycle is valid, that means whatever is controlling us is terrified of us. Because given a long enough stretch of time, we would become smarter than them and overtake them in a very, very short period of time. And short, but in cosmic calendar. Okay, so cosmic calendar is billions of years. So we would become very, very, very advanced very quickly. I mean, what's the next yardstick? If we went from shitting in outhouses to exploring space and the World Wide Web in 4 generations, what are the next 4 generations going to do? Is it just going to keep growing exponentially? And if this exponential growth happens every 4 generations, where are we in 1,000 years? And if it's true, and the last hundred and the time frame I give, and it's interesting to note that the chunk of time I chose to examine in The Devil in Us is almost exactly the cycle that Jason is giving in Archaics. I give 144 years in The Devil in Us, and he says the cycles happen in 138 years. So it's kind of fascinating. There's a knot to untie there. But I don't think that a recurring 138-year cycle is the correct response to this situation. But certainly something is a bit fishy. There's no doubt about it. Very, very fishy. What I'm suggesting tonight, sticking to my own theory, is even darker than the 138-year cycle. My theory is that the entire idea of cultural conflict is a lie. It's a lie. And it's used over and over and over again to win our consent to do things that are detrimental to us as a human collective, but beneficial to the rulers and controllers. And the rulers are the subordinates of the controllers. The controllers are the multidimensional controllers, the loosh harvesters, the energy harvesters, the genetic thieves. It's just a nasty assortment of different things, you know. Some of them actually, you know, consume us in ways that are not quite as food, but consume us as drugs. You know, using the components of a human body to fabricate mind-altering drugs. This is a habit of some of the beings that we're dealing with that are non-human. And this suppression we're kept in for reasons that are very worth contemplating. It's absolutely mandatory that they gain our consent to do this. Now I want you to stop and think about that really well. Why? Why is it so important that our consent be given? Is it because the energy of our consciousness is harvested to manifest the end result? And consent is the first stage, or manufacturing consent, to borrow an expression from Noam Chomsky. By the way, when he wrote that book, he was referring to the unbelievable bias the New York Times had toward Israel. And he wrote Manufacturing Consent in 1984. And it's interesting to note that in 2025, the New York Times is one of the biggest critics of Israel now. How times change. And I don't believe anything about this Israel conflict either. I think the end goal is to get our consent, the global consent on some level. I mean, I think you have to hit about anywhere between 50 and 55% legitimately to be able to do it without offending what we would call the causal force. And I'm actually suggesting to you today that the entirety of World War II was a ruse to get our consent as a human race, as a national entity in the West, to design and deploy atomic weaponry based on the splitting of the atom, and splitting the atom in particular. Okay? And that's another thing that's odd about, you know, Jason's 138-year theory. So they're almost like a game of Clue. They must drop certain things at the beginning of these 138-year cycles so we can begin, because the general theory of relativity comes out in 1905, as I stated yesterday. which is very close to the beginning of this new cycle. So it's a carryover from the old cycle. So it's not it's not a complete and total destruction of the past. Anyways, enough about that. The real thing that I wanted to hammer home tonight is the magical effect of the bomb and fission and fusion, splitting the atom. In doing that, now when you go back, all of the photos in the public space related to mushroom clouds and fireballs have been doctored. This just came out about 5 years ago. You can top drop this if you want. You can look into it. I'm telling you the truth. The original photos have in the ball of fire, there's all these spots of light like the orbs over New Jersey. Now I want you to think about this. If the atom is the building block of our reality, so first come atoms, then come molecules, and then the molecules go on to form elements on the chemical elements on the periodic table, and those chemical elements form organic and non-organic building blocks. And then those combinations of molecules or atoms form molecules that become the building blocks of everything. For example, this is a very interesting one. Atomic composition of carbon. Listen to this. A carbon atom is composed of 6 protons, 6 neutrons, and 6 electrons. 6, 6, 6. With the number of protons defining its atomic number of 6. The most common form or isotope of carbon is carbon-12, which contains 6 protons and 6 neutrons in its nucleus and 6 electrons in orbits around the nucleus. And that's the building block of life. It's also the number of the beast, 666. Isn't that interesting? So when you split an atom, you're splitting this reality, which is why everybody's starting to get all religious about CERN, the Hadron Collider, right? You got all kinds of crazy stuff out there on the internet. I believe it. Some of it I believe. You know, they're trying to open a portal to hell, and they're trying to open a portal to another dimension. All of these things. And whatever you think about that, you can't help but notice that since the very beginning of this scientific evolution in physics, there is a preponderance of Kabbalists, Masons, Satanists, ritual magicians, and highly destructive people, many of them connected to Aleister Crowley and his form of ritual magic, which I think is Thelmetic magic, or magic of Thelma, Thelma. And then you've got that picture that Crowley drew of one of his spirit visitors, Lamb, which looks almost exactly like how we see aliens today. You got Jack Parsons. I mean, all this stuff's in the books if you haven't read Stardust Ranch, Light of Darkness, and The Devil in Us. And so is it really that far-fetched? Is it really that far-fetched that the entire purpose of World War II was to gain the world's consent, or one part of the world, the West, and ultimately the whole world through the proliferation of nuclear weapons, to get our consent to this consistent practice of splitting the atom. Very fascinating. And then letting in a lot of, when you split the atom, which is the foundational component of our reality, you would inherently open up a gateway to another reality, because you've split the basis of our reality. Okay? It's absolutely fascinating. Absolutely fascinating. It's also interesting to watch the same logic at play today as we race into general artificial intelligence. What are we being told? What were we told? What did Oppenheimer rationalize in the movie? And the movie is based on fact. What did Oppenheimer rationalize or use as a rationalization for the moral irresponsibility of creating a weapon like that? Well, if we didn't do it, the Nazis would have done it. Now, I've heard stories from credible sources that Fat Boy and Little Man were actually bombs developed by the Germans. And they were brought over from Germany, which would suggest that there was collaboration all through the war. And this doesn't surprise me. And I know in terms of rational discourse, I'm on thin ice tonight. But I've already brought Jason from Archaics in, and he's on thin ice, so let's just have a little bit of fun. Right? It's like there's a plan being unfolded on the human race, but they can't unfold it unless they get us to consent. And they'll do anything to get that consent. It's not a free will consent, because the needs of our body and the needs of our family are always leveraged to gain the consent. You know, there's always this fear. The same thing happened in 2008. Who was it? Hank Paulson? Who was the Treasury Secretary back then? Who was the Treasury Secretary during the 2008 bail-in? Henry Paulson. Yeah, Henry Paulson. I called him Hank Paulson. Henry. Well, maybe they do call him Hank. Yeah, Henry Paulson. You remember the quotes? There will be blood on the streets. This is complete. If we don't issue this money, it's complete chaos. There will be a freeze in liquidity. Society will collapse. It's Planet of the Apes. It's, Walking Dead. It's, name any horror scenario you can think of. And they're doing the very same thing with AI now. Well, we have to do it. China will do it if we don't do it. And there's always this enemy. Always this enemy forcing our hand. Now, if this isn't a conspiracy, and this is really the way things work, it means that the human race can only evolve to a certain point before self-destruction naturally takes place. Because we can't harmonize as a human race. Which is why I'm a globalist in terms of spiritual global community, as I expressed in a previous podcast. I'm not a globalist if that globalization is being led by draconian forces, like the banking cartels and the controller cartels on this planet. That's not a good form of globalization. It's going to lower everybody in the planet's standard of living. There are going to be serfs and lords again, right? And that's the way they like running this world, serfs and lords. But either scenario is equally frightening, isn't it? The one scenario being that the whole thing is arranged to get our consent. And the other scenario is that it's not. This is just human nature. And because we're so competitive and so greedy and so power hungry as nations, races, regions, and peoples, as technology expands, we inevitably destroy ourselves because our competitive instinct will fail to allow us to harmonize. And we keep bringing horrible things into the world, like atomic energy. Well, not bad if it's done with thorium. China just produced the world's first thorium reactor. And artificial general intelligence, which, And so the consent that they end up getting is leveraged by a context of terror that they manufacture. And maybe that's part of the spiritual test for the human race, is to stand up to this terror and say, well, no. And I've certainly given you enough evidence tonight that at some point you're going to have to do it. You're going to have to deny your consent, because the logical path of continuing to consent to diabolical invention and manifestation like atomic weapons, nuclear weapons, and artificial general intelligence is the enslavement or destruction of the human race. So it becomes a damned if you do or damned if you don't situation. Well, I can't deny my consent. They'll fire me from my job. I'll lose my pension. I'll lose my house. Or you give your consent and the whole human race loses its freedom or its life. It's a daunting circumstance. Very daunting. I think that's enough for tonight. I'm going to call this podcast The Reason for Chaos. I'm Bruce McDonald, and this has been the Talamanca Review.